Marcus Chen stood in the elevator, his daughter's drawing crumpled in his pocket, watching the woman who'd barely acknowledged his existence for 6 months now frozen in the lobby below. CEO Victoria Ashford, brilliant, untouchable, always 3 steps ahead of everyone, had just watched him laugh with another woman in the coffee shop across the street. And for the first time since he'd started working at Ashford Industries, she was staring at him like he was the only person in the world. But what she didn't know was that in exactly 48 hours, Marcus would be gone, and the real reason would shatter everything she thought she understood about the quiet man from accounting. Marcus had perfected the art of being invisible. It wasn't difficult when you were a single father working in the accounting department of a Fortune 500 company, arriving early to leave early, keeping your head down, and never quite fitting into the after-work drinks culture that seemed to define success at Ashford Industries. At 34, he'd learned that invisibility was a kind of armor, and he wore it well. The morning routine never changed. Wake up at 5:30, make breakfast for 7-year-old Sophie, braid her hair while she told him about whatever book she was reading, drop her at school, and arrive at the office by 8:15. His desk was in the corner of the 3rd floor, facing a wall, which suited him perfectly. He could work in peace, leave by 4:30 to pick Sophie up from after-school care, and still meet every deadline with the kind of precision that kept him employed but not noticed. Victoria Ashford occupied a different universe entirely. Marcus had seen her exactly 17 times in 6 months, and he'd counted because each encounter had the same effect. A brief moment where the air seemed to change, where her presence commanded every room she entered, and then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and the uncomfortable awareness of just how far apart their worlds were. She was 39, self-made, and according to office gossip, had built Ashford Industries from a struggling tech startup into a billion-dollar empire through sheer force of will and an intellect that intimidated even the board members. She was also, Marcus couldn't help but notice, devastatingly beautiful in a way that seemed almost beside the point. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair always pulled back in a perfect twist, and eyes that looked right through people as if calculating their worth in real time. The first time she'd walked past his desk, she hadn't even glanced in his direction. The 2nd through 16th times were identical. The 17th time, about 3 weeks ago, he'd held the elevator door for her when she was running late, her phone pressed to her ear, and she'd stepped in without acknowledgement, as if he were part of the machinery. He'd pressed the button for the executive floor, and she'd continued her conversation in rapid Mandarin, closing a deal worth millions while he stood in the corner. Once again, invisible. "Dad, you're doing it again," Sophie had said that evening, watching him stare at his dinner without eating. She had his same dark eyes, his same stubborn chin, but her mother's smile, the one thing he had left of the woman who'd died when Sophie was 2, leaving him to figure out fatherhood alone. "Doing what, sweetheart?" "Thinking about work stuff. You get this wrinkle." She'd reached across the table and poked the space between his eyebrows. "Right here, like you're trying to solve a really hard math problem." He'd laughed and stolen a bite of her macaroni. "Maybe I am. Maybe I'm trying to figure out how you eat so much and stay so tiny." "I'm growing, Dad. Miss Peterson says I grew a whole inch since September." She'd paused, her fork hovering over her plate. "Are we okay with money and stuff?" The question had hit him like a punch. At 7, she was already learning to worry, already picking up on the stress he tried so hard to hide. "We're fine, Sophie, I promise." "Why do you ask?" "Because Melissa's dad lost his job, and now she can't do gymnastics anymore. And I heard you on the phone last night talking about bills." He'd reached across and taken her small hand in his. "Hey, look at me. We are fine. You don't need to worry about grown-up stuff, okay? That's my job. Your job is to keep growing inches and reading books and teaching me about whatever dinosaur you're obsessed with this week." "Therizinosaurus," she'd said solemnly. "It had claws this long." She'd spread her arms as wide as they'd go. "But it was a herbivore, which means it only ate plants. Isn't that funny? Why would you need giant claws if you only eat salad?" "Maybe to defend itself from people who tried to steal its salad." She'd giggled, and the moment had passed, but the conversation had stayed with him. The truth was, they were barely okay. The medical bills from Sophie's pneumonia last winter were still crushing him, and the cost of living in the city kept climbing while his salary stayed frozen. He'd been applying for better positions, but everything seemed to require either more experience or more education, and he had neither. Single fathers with evening responsibilities and no advanced degrees didn't climb corporate ladders. They clung to whatever rung they'd managed to reach and hoped they didn't fall. That was 2 weeks ago. Then everything changed on a Tuesday morning in the coffee shop across from Ashford Industries. Marcus had been running late, which almost never happened. Sophie had woken up with a stomachache, and he'd spent an extra 20 minutes convincing her she was well enough for school, that he'd have his phone on him, that she could call anytime. By the time he'd rushed into the coffee shop, his usual carefully managed schedule was in chaos. "Marcus, over here!" He turned to see Elena Rodriguez waving from a corner table. Elena worked in HR and had been kind to him since his first day. One of the few people who remembered he existed and treated him like a full human being rather than a furniture fixture. She was around his age, warm and funny, with 2 kids of her own and an ex-husband who sent child support exactly as irregularly as possible. "I'm really late," he'd started, but she'd cut him off. "5 minutes. Sit. You look like you're about to collapse, and I just ordered you your usual because I figured you hadn't eaten." She wasn't wrong. He'd sunk into the chair across from her, and she'd pushed a coffee and a bagel toward him. "Rough morning?" Sophie had a stomachache. False alarm, I think, but you never know. "God, I know that panic. Last month, Danny convinced himself he had appendicitis because he'd watched some medical show. Turned out he'd eaten 3 bags of hot Cheetos." Marcus had laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days. They'd talked for exactly 6 minutes about the chaos of single parenthood, about impossible schedules and guilt that never quite went away. And for those 6 minutes, Marcus had felt seen. Elena had a way of making the struggles feel less isolating, of turning stress into shared dark humor. "We're ridiculous," she'd said, checking her phone. "We're literally bonding over our children's gastrointestinal issues." "Welcome to glamorous single-parent life." "Speaking of glamorous, did you submit your application for the senior analyst position?" He'd frozen. "How did you know about that?" "Marcus, I work in HR. I know everything. And yes, before you ask, you have a real shot. Your work is excellent, and Thompson's been singing your praises to anyone who'll listen." "Thompson knows I exist?" "See, this is your problem. You think you're invisible, but people notice. You're reliable, brilliant with numbers, and you never cause drama. In a company this size, that's basically a superpower." She'd leaned forward. "Promise me you won't sabotage yourself with that self-deprecating thing you do. You deserve this." He'd promised, though he hadn't quite believed her. But the conversation had lifted something in him, had made the morning feel less overwhelming. When they'd finally stood to leave, Elena had hugged him, a quick, friendly gesture, and he'd hugged her back, grateful for the kindness of being treated like a person instead of a ghost. Neither of them had noticed Victoria Ashford standing in the lobby of Ashford Industries across the street, her morning meeting having been canceled, watching through the plate glass window as her most invisible employee laughed with a woman she didn't recognize, looking more alive than she'd ever seen him look in 6 months. Victoria had told herself she looked away because she had work to do. She'd told herself that the strange twist in her chest was irritation at wasted time, at canceled meetings and disrupted schedules. She'd told herself a lot of things that morning, and not one of them was true. The truth was that for the first time in years, Victoria Ashford had seen someone and felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The resignation letter sat on Marcus's desk for 3 days before he found the courage to print it. 2 weeks' notice. Professional, brief, grateful for the opportunity. It didn't mention the job offer in Denver. Better pay, better hours, lower cost of living, and a chance for Sophie to be near his sister who'd been begging him to move closer for years. It didn't mention that he'd finally accepted that staying in the city meant staying invisible, staying stuck, staying barely afloat. Some things didn't belong in resignation letters. He planned to submit it on Friday, give himself the weekend to prepare Sophie for the change, and start the new job in 6 weeks. Clean, simple, final. What he didn't plan for was Victoria Ashford appearing at his desk on Thursday afternoon at 4:15, 15 minutes before he usually left, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Marcus Chen? Her voice was different than he'd expected. Softer, less certain than the commanding tone he'd heard in the elevator. He'd stood so quickly his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "Yes, Ms. Ashford, Can I help you with something?" She'd glanced at his desk, at the precisely organized files and the framed photo of Sophie holding up a gap-toothed grin, at the drawing taped to his monitor showing him and Sophie as superheroes. "You leave at 4:30. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am, I have to pick up my daughter from after-school care. I arrive early to compensate, and I'm not criticizing, I'm observing." She'd paused, and something flickered across her face. "Thompson says you're applying for the senior analyst position." "I was, yes." He'd caught the past tense in his own words too late. "Was?" Her eyes had sharpened. "You're withdrawing your application?" It's complicated." "I see." She'd looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus had the unsettling sensation of being truly seen, of the invisibility armor cracking. "Walk with me." It hadn't been a request. Victoria Ashford had turned and walked toward the elevators, and Marcus had followed, his heart hammering, aware that every person on the floor was watching, that the invisible man was suddenly very, very visible and had no idea why. The elevator ride to the executive floor had been silent. She'd led him to her office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, minimalist furniture, a desk that probably cost more than his car. She'd gestured to a chair and taken the one across from it, not behind her desk, which had somehow made everything more intense. "I'm going to be direct," she'd said. "I saw you last Tuesday, in the coffee shop." Marcus's mind had raced. I wasn't late. I clocked in on time. I don't care about the time." She'd cut him off, then seemed to struggle with her next words. "Who was she?" The question had hung in the air, completely unexpected. "I'm sorry?" "The woman you were with, in the coffee shop. You were laughing. You hugged her." Victoria's voice had been carefully neutral, but her hands had tightened on the arms of her chair. Understanding had dawned slowly, then all at once, and with it came something Marcus hadn't felt in years. A spark of power, of being wanted, of mattering to someone who had never looked at him before. "Elena Rodriguez, she works in HR. We're friends. She's a single parent, too." She was giving me advice about he had stopped, suddenly uncertain what he was explaining or why. About applying for positions I probably won't get. About believing I'm worth more than I think I am. He'd met her eyes. "Ms. Ashford, why am I here?" She'd stood then, walked to the window, her back to him. "I have built this company from nothing. I work 16-hour days. I've sacrificed relationships, friendships, any semblance of a life outside these walls. I've told myself it's worth it, that success is enough." She'd turned back to face him. "And then I saw you laughing with someone in a coffee shop, and I realized I don't remember the last time I laughed like that. I don't remember the last time I looked forward to anything that wasn't a business meeting or a board presentation." Marcus had sat very still, unsure if he was supposed to respond. "I've walked past your desk 17 times in 6 months, Victoria had continued. "And I never saw you, not really. And that's my failure, not yours. Because Thompson showed me your work yesterday. Your analysis of the quarterly projections, your suggestions for streamlining our processes. And it's brilliant. You're brilliant. And I never noticed because I've trained myself not to see people, just productivity." "I'm not brilliant," Marcus had said quietly. "I'm just someone trying to keep his head above water." "Why are you withdrawing your application?" He'd pulled out his phone, shown her the email from the Denver company. "Because I got a better offer. Not better work, probably not even a better company, but better for my daughter. Better pay, lower cost of living, family nearby. I can't keep barely making it here." Sophie deserves more than a father who's constantly stressed about money and time. Victoria had read the email, her expression unreadable. Then she'd handed the phone back. What if I matched it? Better than matched it. What if I offered you the senior analyst position with a 20% increase over what Denver is offering? Flexible hours, remote work options twice a week, and full medical coverage with no deductible? Marcus had stared at her. Why would you do that? Because you're good at your job. Because this company needs people who do excellent work without needing to be seen doing it. Because Thompson will kill me if I let you go. She'd paused. And because I want to learn how to laugh in a coffee shop again, and I think maybe you could teach me. The last sentence had been barely audible, and it had changed everything. Marcus had seen the vulnerability in it, the admission from a woman who probably never admitted to needing anything from anyone. Miss Ashford. Victoria, please. Victoria. The name had felt strange in his mouth. I don't think you need anyone to teach you how to be happy. I think you've just forgotten it's allowed. And you remember? I have to. Sophie's watching everything I do, learning how to be an adult from me. If I'm miserable all the time, that's what I'm teaching her. That life is something to endure, not enjoy. So I find moments, small ones, her laugh, a good book, a friend who reminds me I'm not alone. They're not enough to solve everything, but they're enough to keep going. Victoria had sat back down across from him. I don't have children. I don't have family nearby. I had a husband once, a long time ago, who told me I loved my work more than I loved him. He wasn't wrong. She'd met his eyes. I don't know how to be the person you're describing, but I'd like to learn, and I'd like you to stay. This isn't about me, Marcus had said carefully. Is it? It's about both of us. I'm offering you a legitimate promotion you've earned. But yes, I'm also asking if you'd have coffee with me sometime. As people, not as CEO and employee. I'm asking very badly because I haven't asked anyone anything personal in about a decade, and I'm terrified I'm crossing every professional line that exists. Marcus had thought about Denver, about safety and family and the easy choice. Then he'd thought about Sophie's drawing on his monitor, about her asking if they were okay, about teaching her that sometimes the brave choice isn't the safe one. I need to think about it, he'd said. Not about the job. Yes to the job if you're serious. But the rest, I need to be sure it's real and not just a moment. Sophie comes first, always. I understand, and I respect that. Victoria had stood, extended her hand. Take the weekend. Let me know Monday. And Marcus, thank you for being honest with me. I don't think anyone has been in a very long time. He'd shaken her hand, felt the warmth of it, the slight tremor that suggested she was as nervous as he was. Then he'd left her office, taken the elevator down to the third floor, and sat at his desk for a long moment, staring at the resignation letter he no longer needed. That Friday evening, Marcus had taken Sophie to the park. She'd run ahead to the swings, and he'd sat on a bench watching her fly higher and higher, fearless in a way he'd forgotten how to be. His phone had buzzed, a text from Victoria. Just 3 words. I'm trying too. He'd smiled, and for the first time in years, the future felt less like a burden and more like a possibility. On Monday morning, Marcus had arrived at work to find a new desk waiting for him. Window view, senior analyst nameplate, and a card from Victoria that read, "For teaching me that visibility goes both ways. Looking forward to coffee. V." In her office, 40 floors above, Victoria had stood at her window, watching the city wake up, and allowed herself something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She didn't know where this was going. She didn't know if Marcus would say yes to coffee, if this was the beginning of something or just a moment of clarity that would fade. But she knew that for the first time in a decade, she'd looked at someone and seen not just an employee, but a person. And he'd looked back and seen not just a CEO, but a woman who'd forgotten she was allowed to want more than success. Sophie had hugged her dad extra tight that morning before school. You're different, she'd said. Happy different. Maybe I am, sweetheart. Maybe I am. 3 months later, Victoria and Marcus had their third coffee date. This time with Sophie, who interrogated Victoria about whether she knew what a therizinosaurus was and why someone needed giant claws for salad. Victoria, to Marcus's surprise and delight, had done her research and discussed herbivore defense mechanisms for 15 minutes, while Sophie's eyes had grown wider with impressed approval. "She's smart, Dad," Sophie had whispered loudly afterward. "You can keep her." Victoria had laughed, really laughed, and Marcus had seen the woman she'd forgotten she could be, the one buried under years of armor. And she'd seen him too, no longer invisible, no longer barely holding on, but standing in the light, worthy and seen and choosing to stay. The CEO had ignored the single dad until she saw him with another woman. But what had really changed wasn't jealousy or competition. It was the moment Victoria Ashford had realized that success without connection was just another form of invisibility. And Marcus Chen, the man from accounting who'd perfected the art of not being seen, had taught her that sometimes being visible means having the courage to let someone truly see you. They'd both been invisible in different ways, and they'd found each other by finally learning to look. The end. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who can teach us the most about being human. Success isn't measured in titles or bank accounts, but in moments of genuine connection, in courage to be vulnerable, and in the willingness to see and be seen. Marcus taught Victoria that happiness isn't something you earn, it's something you allow, and Victoria taught Marcus that being invisible isn't safety, it's a different kind of prison. Together, they learned that the bravest thing you can do is let someone matter.